Welcome back to the Foreign Desk. I'm Lisa Daftari. A hard reset. That's what the President Biden's team has set out to do in less than 1 month of being in the White House. Executive orders reversing dozens of Trump-era policies and an entirely different vision of what America should be. Many things, but perhaps not first. To help us with analysis on all this, I want to invite back to the program Victoria Coates, who is the Senior Fellow at the Center for Security Policy, former Senior Policy Advisor to the Secretary of Energy, Deputy National Security Advisor for Middle Eastern and North African Affairs under President Trump, and before that, National Security Advisor for Senator Ted Cruz. And of course, what many might not know about her, and which is most impressive to me, is a PhD in art history from the University of Pennsylvania, a terrific school, and is the author of David Sling, A History of Democracy in 10 Works of Art. Welcome to the program, Victoria.
Thank you, Lisa, so much, and for that kind introduction, although I'm reminded of what my former boss, Don Rumsfeld, used to say, which is makes it sound like I can't hold a job.
I would just say you were very young when you started, and I have been very fortunate enough to have known you through most of those chapters of your life, and connected with you early on in my career, which has been fantastic. I look to you as someone who's just incredibly brilliant and grounded, someone who is just so knowledgeable and logical, which sometimes is unique in Washington, D.C. So thank you for everything you do. But I want to start with the fun stuff. A PhD in art history. How did that even happen?
Mm-hmm. Well, it happened because my father, who had a minor in art history at Harvard in the 50s, recommended one day that I'd been taking a lot of politics classes in college, that I take art history because it's good for crossword puzzles. And I took him up on that and just fell in love with the discipline. You know, art history is history with pictures. The whole premise of David Sling is to use objects as primary source documents. So if you want to know about the development of democracy in ancient Athens, learning about the Parthenon is, in a way, learning the history of democracy, and that's the thread that ties the book together. So, in my academic work, I like to try to introduce people to sometimes it's a reintroduction to something very familiar, like Michelangelo's David, for example, and try to look at it in a little bit of a different way to understand both the time period it was created in and then how it has existed throughout its history. And so it's a different way to study history, but a very valuable one.
You make it sound so easy. I took one art history course, and that was in Spain, in Spanish, when I was studying abroad, but it was perhaps one of the most challenging courses I ever took. So it's not that easy. But how did you then make the jump to foreign policy? That's not such a natural segue.
No, it is unusual. I've been remarked before that the last person who did it was Anthony Blunt, and he, of course, was a communist Soviet spy in England in the 60s. So that's not maybe my best model, but I always had a dual track with politics and with my academic work. I find it very beneficial to have kind of an active period of life and then maybe a more contemplative scholarly period to offset it. And when Secretary Rumsfeld retired in the winter of 2006, he had known of me a little bit, and his staff got in touch and asked if I wanted, or if I knew anyone, I guess that was the first conversation, who would help with his autobiography, What Became Known and Unknown. And you have one of these kind of swerve moments where I went up to my husband's office and I said, it's such a shame that none of my academic friends will help him because it's such an incredible American story. But the country was so polarized then, although it looks like child's play now.
Right.
And my husband looked at me and he said, what's your next 4 years look like? You teach at Penn, your first book's about to come out from the Getty. Is this the next 40 years? And I said, I don't think it is. And he said, call up and tell him you'll do it. It was a little bit more complicated than that, but really not much.
Amazing. I mean, these are the moments that I think when people look back and they just say, that's when it happened. And we're thankful for that because we need you in this space. Although I'm sure Penn was very, very, very remiss to let you go. We heard President Joe Biden deliver his first speech on foreign policy. It was delayed, I think, by a week or two because of the snowstorm in DC. So it was very much anticipated. And what I'd like to do, he outlined what we could basically say as a summary was just a reset of all things Trump era, particularly in foreign policy. And let's go area by area. I'd like to get your take on what the next 4 years will mean for us in terms of both policy and posturing. And first, of course, is a very hot area of the Middle East, which has been since biblical times and probably will be in terms of foreign policy for us forever. Israel. What we talked about, you and I, on Monday night, if those who have tuned in for our foreign policy power panel saw Victoria and two other colleagues discuss the Middle East, very much in depth. But we talked about the delay in calling our ally, Bibi Netanyahu, in Israel. And since then, the phone call did take place yesterday. What took so long? What took so long?
I don't know. I mean, some of it can be circumstantial and scheduling, but at the same time, this didn't have to be a story. Regardless of who the prime minister of Israel is one of our key allies, if not the key ally in the Middle East. And, a lot has changed in the region since now President Biden was vice president, due to the Abraham Accords and the sort of reset of the map. I would have thought he would have been much more eager to reach out and to reconnect with Israeli colleagues and really get to know what their new circumstances are. So certainly that was discouraging, that it was not more of a priority, but I'm very happy that it has finally happened.
Yeah, and sticking with that part of the world there, obviously that wasn't a subtle move, like you said. That phone call could have taken place. He called a lot of adversaries ahead of Bibi Netanyahu, which wasn't a good look. How about how quickly, President Biden decided to reinstate that aid to the Palestinians? What's the about face in terms of going forward in that crisis in particular?
Yeah, it's a curious move because of the Abraham Accords. The message from our Arab partners and allies to the Palestinians was, we have given you every opportunity. We have given you hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars over decades to try to support your cause. And we cannot no longer in 2021 give you a veto over our foreign policy. And, Israel has been such a massive success story. And the Israel that has emerged in, the second decade of the 21st century is a powerhouse and punches so hugely above its weight and, a huge asset to the United States. And, be frank about it, we've made a historic investment in Israel. It's paid off extremely well, and I think been very, very positive for us. But that's an enormously important relationship that needs to be both preserved and attended to very, very carefully.
And what about the Abraham Accords? I mean, we heard both from Jared Kushner and President Trump near the end of his term that there are a handful of countries that are in queue to perhaps sign on to the Abraham Accords. Obviously, we're all waiting to see if Saudi Arabia, basically who dominates the region, will be one of those. What will happen with these policy changes? What could possibly happen to the future of the Abraham Accords?
Well, I mean, there's certainly been some very positive signals out of the kingdom. As you know, Lisa, I was there for a long period this fall, and there are obviously discussions about these developments, and certainly the Saudis' decision to allow El Al overflight airspace was a very significant one. And so I think those were all positive indicators. There are other countries. I don't want to reveal anybody's intentions before they've made a decision, but certainly momentum was in our favor. My concern would be that some of the actions of the current administration in terms of the freeze of the arms sales, the reimposition of the aluminum tariffs, these And then there was actually a letter from Senator Inhofe today, and I think 26 or 27 other senators protesting the recognition of Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara. These are all things that can destabilize the Abraham Accords. We had a very long period of a historical reality of hostility to Israel. We've now had roughly 6 months of a much greater rapprochement. It would be a real shame if the actions that are taken now would undermine that.
Yeah, and exactly to your point, it seems like the Biden administration is dealing with an entirely different Middle East. The investment we did make into the Abraham Accords only fortified those changes or that momentum that we were already seeing with the people of the region. I call the Abraham Accords the real Arab Spring, because we saw that coming of age. It was happening for a long time, and kudos, of course, to Donald Trump and Jared Kushner for really enterprising and finding an innovative way to hone in on those changes. Now, when the Biden administration decides to, for example, sign back on to the UN, the Human Rights Council that we pulled out of, mainly because of the way they were treating Israel, when they decide to reinstate aid to the Palestinians, when they decide to cancel a deal to give fighter jets to the UAE and the Saudis, when they decide to take the Houthis off the terror list, in your opinion, do we stand a chance of just being on the wrong side of history for the next 4 years, or will the U.S. have an influential say in how the Middle East goes forward?
We certainly can have an influential say. I think, as I was mentioning before, the idea that the Biden administration, from the U.S. perspective, would hand the veto back to the Palestinians that the Arabs took off the table. So the Israelis start looking to the Arabs to support on the Palestinian issue. I mean, that's got a kind of through the looking glass to it. So, I obviously we're very concerned that really a historic opportunity might be squandered. But it would be my hope that when sort of cooler heads, obviously there's the rush of the first 100 days of any presidency, but when cooler heads prevail and they really look at the situation, they'll see the obvious benefits to this and to expanding it. Certainly they've said some positive things about it. So it would be my hope that they will come around to recognizing this for really the gift that it is.
Yeah, and let's move to the biggest challenge slash symbolic move for the next 4 years will be the Iran deal. We're currently playing a game of chicken. President Biden has said that he won't remove the sanctions, even though the Iran regime has demanded that that we make the first move, that the United States remove the sanctions, and the United States demanding that the Iranian regime go back to complying with the deals, the terms that were set in the 2015 deal. So obviously, there's a lot of back and forth, but we also know that the administration is very eager to get back into a deal. So what do you see happening, and what's the timeline here?
Well, the timeline is probably pretty short. You have the presidential elections coming up in Iran in June, and obviously, as always, the supreme leader will pick the candidates and then cook the outcome for whatever his desired outcome is. We could see a repeat of what we had in the spring, or the summer rather, of 2009 with the Green Revolution. It would be my hope. President Obama himself has said that not being more supportive of that was an error at the time. So hopefully that would be a lesson learned if the Iranian people take it into their heads to protest what will be the same kind of as I said, cooked elections that we've been having for 42 years. So, I think, that potential for positive change in Iran should not be discounted in an eagerness to get back into some version of the JCPOA, because unfortunately at this point, you could really argue that it was fraudulently negotiated on the part of the Iranians because, of course, they didn't reveal their previous nuclear plans and the obvious military dimension of their nuclear plans, which was revealed by the Israelis, obviously, from the confiscated archive from Tehran. So that whole deal was brokered on a lie.
Right.
And fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So if they think they can trust the Iranians to strike a deal after everything that's been revealed, with this regime, it really is hard for me to believe that's going to be successful. And so the the hope with the Cyrus Accords that we discussed earlier in the week is that we can make a very clear offer to the Iranian people that there is a more prosperous, secure future there for the taking for them. That the United States is sincere, that Israel is sincere, that our Gulf friends are sincere. That they want to lower tensions. They want greater peace and prosperity, and that's going to have to be a decision for the Iranian people.
Right. And for those who may have missed Monday's Power Panel, the Cyrus Accords are an initiative that have been proposed by Victoria and Len Khodorkovsky to mimic something along the lines of the Abraham Accords to bring a future of peace and prosperity between Iran and Israel, the people of Iran and Israel. We had a very in-depth conversation about that, and you can check that out on our website if you missed it, because it's just fascinating and it's a tremendous idea. What's interesting is that you look at the Iranian regime, you look at the mullahs, and the rhetoric from the White House hasn't been overly soft just yet. You've heard Biden say, you have to comply, and we're not going to remove the sanctions. It's a no. But we do know that the mullahs are anticipating an easy time with the current White House. How did they get that idea, and to what extent can this be reversed so that they take us seriously?
Well, I believe there are now up to 4 statements out of the State Department about the Houthi in Yemen show just how internally conflicted that policy is. Because on the one hand, you had the intention the stated intention on the part of Secretary Blinken to remove the designation of the Houthi as a foreign terrorist organization on February 16th, which would have been this Monday. They had to come out and issue a statement condemning the Houthi for taking pot shots at civilian targets in Saudi Arabia. And then they had to come out and condemn the Houthi for basically besieging 1 million innocent Yemeni civilians in Ma'rib, I always get that wrong, Ma'rib, in Yemen. It's as if they are insisting the Houthi are not terrorists. They're not going to be on the FTO because they know that will please Tehran and be seen as a non-sanctions kind of an related olive branch. But on the other hand, the Houthi are behaving as they always did. They are not allowing additional humanitarian relief into that poor country. Mm-hmm. They are continuing to attack places where, if the rocket or drone that they fired at Riyadh had landed, that could have landed on American citizens or interests as well as Saudi. So, it's internally conflicted. I don't think it's going to work. But, it seems pretty clear that that's the direction they're headed in.
And speaking of Secretary of State Blinken, he did mention that he is looking to bring some conservatives into his circle before they make any sort of decision on the Iran deal. This way that they have a more balanced approach. Were you or anyone approached to help them out with this?
No. I was summarily let go from my post as president of Middle East Broadcasting Networks on the second day of the administration. So I don't think they had much interest in anything I had to offer on the region. I don't know anyone else who has been approached on that topic. It certainly would be very interesting to see who they might bring in. But given the direction they've already charted, when Secretary Blinken said, the path of diplomacy is open for Iran, if they're already there, they're not even going to try to modify Iran's behavior. They're just going to open the path. I don't know there's much that anyone could say that would be persuasive.
Right. And speaking of your termination, I wasn't going to bring it up, but since you brought it up yourself, thank you. You're so honest and always so kind and humble. When you were given this position, I remember just seeing it and be like, perfect. Oh my gosh, they nailed it. She's the perfect person for this job, for this position. And on day 2, as you said, you were let go. And I turned to, I think my husband, I don't know who was near me, but I think I turned to my husband and I said, maybe that was the mistake of the Trump administration, not letting anyone go from the previous administration. And we had so many leaks and spies and people turning to the media. Was this an all-out, jihad, for lack of a better word, on anyone who was in the pro-Trump team? Did they let everyone go across the board?
They certainly seem to be on that program. And, for the head of MBN, President of MBN, which is myself, but then also the head of Radio Free Asia and then Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, we all had 2-year contracts, which and are not federal government entities. MBN is a 501c4, for example, or C3 rather. And so I had, it broke a 2-year contract with no cause. And so that's what they were willing to do, basically break contract law in order to get rid of anybody they think. Right. What was unfortunate from my viewpoint is, MBN really needed continuity. There have been a lot of changes of leadership. It's an important institution. Information is weaponized now, as you know. We need to tell the truth as aggressively as our adversaries lie.
Right. It just makes it as though partisanship is the number one, credential. It's not about merit. It's not about, continuity, as you said, not about knowledge. It's not about bringing in one team to train the other. On day 2, they wanted to clear everyone out.
Right. And that, that's really, it's too bad. I mean, I would have been my hope they would have actually thought my academic background was a positive for this. One of the mandates for all of the government-supported broadcasting networks is to promote democracy and freedom. That I have a history there, and obviously a history in the region. So I it would have been at least nice to be able to have a conversation with someone, but they clearly were not interested in that.
Yeah, well, that's too bad for them, as you said, and lucky for us to have you do these types of interviews more freely and openly, and we're glad for that. I want to move to China. Crazy that about 10 minutes before our program, I saw this news, and I had to go looking for it, and I'll explain that in a moment, that President Biden has authorized the Wuhan Institute of Virology to receive U.S. taxpayer money through 2024. I saw this just as a headline from a friend who sent it to me, and I said, "Oh, no way! This is fake news. There's no way." And I went searching for it, and you can't find it on Google. I had to go through another search engine to find it, and sure enough, there were 2 articles on this. It's mind-boggling. This is taxpayer money going to China that has given us no transparency. The WHO has said that we've come back empty-handed. First, they said we abandoned our mission, but then they acknowledged that they got nothing out of the Chinese, and now we're going to give them money to keep their secrets in the lab. How does this work?
Yeah, I don't know the details of that particular situation, but this is one of the most concerning things about the new administration have actually been Special Envoy Kerry's comments about our need to make concessions to China on climate. And the Chinese leadership, starting with President Xi, has said a lot of things that have been very well received in Europe. For example, about their desire to be a responsible player in the climate space. And then they don't do anything about it. And suddenly it's beholden on the United States to put the bill, to make concessions to them, to persuade them to simply do the right thing. We're not we're only suggesting that they do what they've already committed publicly to doing. So, this sort of impulse to make these concessions and to appease them, to try to modify their behavior, this has all been tried before. It's never worked. So if the idea, Yeah, if the idea is here that somehow we'll get insight into Wuhan, I think that's pretty much not going to be the case.
And it's not going to stop at Wuhan. This appeasement is going to go across the board. I want you to take a listen to this, and I want to get your thoughts.
I talked about it. I said, look, Chinese leaders, if you know anything about Chinese history, it has always been the time when China has been victimized by the outer world is when they haven't been unified at home. So vastly overstated, the central principle of Xi Jinping is that there must be a united, tightly controlled China. And he uses his rationale for the things he does based on that. I point out to him, no American president can be sustained as a president if he doesn't reflect the values of the United States. And so the idea, I'm not going to speak out against what he's doing in Hong Kong, what he's doing with the Uyghurs in western mountains of China, and Taiwan trying to end the one China policy by making it forceful. I said, and by the way, he said he gets it. Culturally, there are different norms at each country, and their leaders are expected to follow.
Where do we start on this? Let's unpack this one item at a time. First and foremost, obviously, people are calling this a genocide, and he's calling it different norms. Had this been the previous president, the media would have received this very, very differently.
Oh, of course. When President Biden says stuff like this, it shows he's sophisticated and diplomatic. That is going to be the media take on that. But I think, it's such an egregious example of his just accepting President Xi's narrative and then repeating it in public. It's basically Chinese propaganda.
Yes,
this is fine. It's just different norms. No, it's millions of people in concentration camps. It's, imprisoned protesters in Hong Kong and all of the other, really egregious behavior that the PRC has engaged in, which more and more is being exposed. And I think, a much better model might have been Ronald Reagan, who very frankly and openly spoke out against the atrocities of Soviet communism, but also met with his Russian counterparts and negotiated successfully with them. And so I think that would be perhaps a better model of moral clarity rather than this kind of diplomatic doublespeak, which is coming out of the PRC propaganda machine.
Right. And, the party of tolerance, the party of equality, the party of, fighting for what's right. And all of a sudden giving a pass to, China going in and having these protesters in Hong Kong, slaughtered, or, throwing innocent protesters into jail, or what's going on, throughout the region, their transgressions are just given a big pass. I mean, this is around the world. We're looking at the same thing with the Iranian regime, the same thing in Russia. Why isn't the media calling them out on their hypocrisy? Is everyone in on this together? And why isn't this is like the elephant in the room? This is horrific to give this just a pass.
Well, and I think history will really frown on this. If you look at 1989 and Tiananmen Square, I think the maybe not illogical mindset that we found ourselves in was after the Berlin Wall came down that liberalization and democracy were inevitable, and this would just happen, and we could engage China economically, and they would turn into liberal democracy. Obviously that didn't happen. So doing that again now, turning a blind eye to these things, giving them a pass, is not going to come to a better result. And I have to say, Lisa, there's a lot of enthusiasm in the mainstream media for President Biden and his administration, but there's also a lot of discomfort with what China is doing. So I think I would applaud the New York Times for their December 19th article with ProPublica about the Wuhan information campaign. That was a hard-hitting, important piece. The BBC.
Or the BBC, they were just removed from China because they did an actual reporting piece on what's going on there. Right.
Yes. And so I think that is that could be encouraging. I don't know that they're ever going to be hard on President Biden, but hopefully they can find it in their hearts to be hard on the PRC.
Right. And it seems like it's going to be impossible for this administration to take a tough stance on China, even though they know that they're stealing our technology and our patents and our jobs and manufacturing, and they're not playing fairly on the world stage. But it's scary where we will be in 4 years after more damage is done by the Chinese government. I want to move to Russia. In the beginning of President Biden's foreign policy speech, he began with Russia, thinking he's taking a very, again, about face from President Trump's relationship with Russia, which is fabricated, of course, but that's the vision. And he said, "I made it clear to President Putin in a manner very different from my predecessor that the days of the United States rolling over in the face of Russia's aggressive actions are over." What happened? Within hours of going into the White House, this administration got right back into the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty right away. And no leveraging, no preconditions, nothing. Did that really give them that sign and that message?
Well, unfortunately, no. I mean, I think the extension, the 5-year extension of New START was really a big mistake. Again, you can go back and look at New START. There is strong evidence that the Russians negotiated that treaty fraudulently, which is something I think the Congress should take another look at. But I think, in terms of being tough on Russia, certainly the myriad sanctions that we put on Russia during the course of the Trump administration, I think the rebalancing of NATO, particularly in terms of European defense budgets, was a very clear signal to Russia that we were not going to simply let them extend their influence over Eastern or, God forbid, Western Europe. And I think the main challenge that will be coming up in coming weeks and months is Nord Stream 2, the pipeline from Russia to Germany that the Germans are very enthusiastic about. They think putting their energy security into Moscow's hands is somehow a good idea. It isn't. It's going to be a tool for coercion and blackmail. And I think there are many other ways to diversify Europe's energy stream that would be far more beneficial.
And because you have an experience in the energy sector as well, I want to get your take on Keystone. What was your initial? What do you think it's done to us as a nation, particularly with many voting for President Biden to not do this? He let a lot of people down.
Yeah, I think Keystone is a very unfortunate episode. In a way, we have kind of a tale of two pipelines here. One that leads to greater American energy diversification, supply, and security. One that leads to the potential blackmail of Germany. These are enormously important conduits. And one of the great good news stories of really the last 10 years, particularly the last 4 years, of the American energy renaissance, and the kind of leverage that gives us over global energy markets, and our ability to supply ourselves needs to be, it's not something you want to do because obviously you're part of a global system, but our emergence as one of the 3 big producers is a game changer, as much as the Abraham Accords were a game changer. And unilaterally surrendering that by canceling a major pipeline is just it's like the extension of New START. You're giving something away for free, and getting rid of your strategic advantages. And it's deeply unfortunate. It's unfortunate for people whose livelihoods are ruined by this, and it didn't have to happen. And so that's an issue I'm going to continue to remain very active on.
Yeah, actually, speaking of which, you are now a senior fellow for the Center for Security Policy, our good friends over there. What are you working on? What's in the future for you? What could we see from you very soon?
Well, I mean, obviously the Cyrus Accords, that op-ed came out about 3 weeks ago now, and we are starting to build out what the accords look like. I think, Len had a really remarkable vision there for, this sort of spark of contact, hopefully between the Iranian and Israeli and American people. I think the letter that came out of Iran around the same time, signed by individual members of the opposition who are in Iran, so they're vulnerable, is something that really is their way to message us that they're there. The Iranian regime will tell you there's no opposition. They're not organized, they're fractured, they're internally divided. They don't exist. You have to deal with us. Well, that's not the case. They've told us who they are. They've told us that they're there. And so I think, building the Cyrus Accords is something I want to focus on very much. And then also looking at initiatives to help the Iranian people communicate. I think there has been traditionally a great deal of bipartisan congressional interest in supporting ways to increase internet access, to encrypt user identity so you can't be targeted. And I really, that's something I very, very much want to work on, probably starting next month.
Wow, and that's tremendous. And I will be translating our panel from Monday night on the Cyrus Accords, as well as this interview, into Farsi, because Victoria, what you're doing for the Iranian people is so tremendous. You, Len, Bijan, all of you are working tirelessly to really echo the voices of people who cannot be heard, even though they are out there, as you said, trying to get our attention like they did in 2009, but on an entirely different level. I think that's what people perhaps may not get from the media, is that they are there and they're just unabashedly on the streets, willing to risk their lives to tell us what they want. And what we've heard, even from the Trump administration, was we're looking for behavioral change. We're not looking for regime change, because it's not something that we want to cause. It's not something that it's in our hands, but we can definitely give them a voice and a platform to do so. So I will definitely be translating this interview as well, so that they can hear about all the work that you're doing. And I thank you for being with us today. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but that was perfect. And hopefully we'll have you back here again, and we will rely on you, your vision, your expertise, all of it, to help us make sense of this. Thank you so much, Victoria.
Thank you.
Hopefully talk to you soon. And for all of you, if you'd like to subscribe to our podcast, go to youtube.com/Lisa Daftari. And to sign up for our daily top 10 email, go to foreigndesknews.com/newsletter, and you can sign up there. Thank you so much. See you again next week.